I walk around organizations and just see people looking absolutely exhausted. And when you do some of the work that I do, which is around cultural surveys to help understand to what extent do we have an environment that's conducive to innovation, you dig a little bit deeper and you just see people saying, yeah, I used to love my job. I used to love coming in, the buzz of the team. The team's now in half, but we're all doing the same work. We're all doing 120, 130% of what we used to be doing. No extra resources, no extra grace. Deadlines are getting tighter. So no wonder you see this statistic of 1 in 5 people in America dying simply by going to work, because we're not being realistic about what it means for a human being to do their best work.
Do you want to go back to normal after Corona? Do you really want to go back to normal? I don't. Welcome to Not Back to Normal. I am Markus Struhn, and I want COVID-19 to change the business world for the better. In each episode, I talk to entrepreneurs, business leaders, and change makers about how they have adapted in this crisis and how they further intend to change the way they live, work, and run their businesses for the better to make capitalism much more conscious and working for all. In this episode, I'm speaking with Elvin Turner. Elvin is an award-winning innovation expert and associate professor of innovation, entrepreneurship, and marketing for MBA and executive education programs. He has coached hundreds of corporate innovation initiatives around the world, coaching leaders in some of the world's most innovative organizations in the finance, technology, music, drinks, and publishing industries to overcome the many barriers that they face when trying to turn new ideas into action. His new book is called Be Less Zombie: How Great Organizations Create Dynamic Innovation, Fearless Leadership, and Passionate People. Unusual title, you may think, but unfortunately, the zombie-like state of being has been the old normal in many organizations, especially large corporates. In this conversation, Elvin and I are exploring the path from zombiedom to angelhood. When I checked the antonyms to zombie, angel stood out for me with its connotation of being soulful, warm-hearted, smart, and wise. In this episode, you will learn that innovation is first and foremost a choice, how the mechanics of innovation resemble the process of adaptation in nature, why bad incentives turn good actors into innovation zombies, the difference between leading innovation from the top and growing it from the bottom up, why small experiments are essential to convince naysayers, how to make innovation inevitable, and how the global industrial giant 3M achieves this with a compelling KPI. Why Elvin thinks progress for human needs to be a yardstick for innovation and not product-centric. I really rate his innovation for realist's approach, and now I bring you Elvin Turner. Elvin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. I have your book in front of me. It's called Be Less Zombie. What's in the name? Why this name?
Well, it was funny. It kind of came about by accident in some ways. I was running a session for Henley Business School, and they were looking for something a little bit different around innovation. And we tried a few different ideas out. And at the time, unicorns was a word that was out there around the idea of organizations who are worth $1 billion and they're still kind of in startup scale-up mode. And everyone was looking at what does it take to be a unicorn? And I was thinking, well, that is interesting. But a lot of the feedback I get when I'm talking to clients is, well, we're never going to be a unicorn. We've been around for 100 years. Why would we try and be a mutton dressed as lamb? That just doesn't make any sense to us. So I thought it might be interesting to create this event called Unicorns versus Zombies. The zombie being an organization that's really running out of road, not exactly the living dead. I mean, it was a bit of fun, the name, but it was really a serious point that I was seeing all around, which is organizations that, you open the big idea cupboard, there's very little in there. People who are worn out, and it was a serious point behind it as at an individual level, because as I was doing the research for the book, I came across this fact that 1 in 5 Americans now die because of going to work. that scale of death is attributed to the stress that you experience at work, and then the secondary diseases that come from that, cancer and heart failure and all sorts of other things. And so this idea of a zombie organization full of people feeling somewhat zombie in the levels of energy and motivation kind of resonated. And we ran the event. It went very well. We ran it another couple of times. And as part of the process, I was coming up with these be less zombie principles. And I just sat there one day after working on some slides thinking, be less zombie, be less zombie. Hey, that could be a book. And it kind of went from there, really. That was the initial starting point anyway.
Wow, that's really cool. I really like that. And so what I have in mind for this conversation is to frame it from be less zombie, be more of what exactly? So you mentioned the word unicorn, and that's obviously quite associated with startups. I actually had to look up the thesaurus, like what is the opposite? What is the antonym of zombie? And it came up with angel. That was one of the terms that quite resonated with me. And so what does an angel stand for? An angel stands for being smart, being wise, being full of life, being soulful, being sort of like warm-heated and warm-blooded. And so I'd really like to have this conversation in the context of what does it take to get there? What is the road ahead for a company, for executives in a company to be less zombie and to become more angel-like or unicorn-like? Just conjuring up these images, what comes to mind when you hear zombie, angel, unicorn? How do you get from A to B?
So I'd never really thought about that angel point before. I really like that. And you think about where, angels show up in the Bible, they're bringers of wisdom or they're bringing a warning. So they're all good things for an organization that's firing on all cylinders around innovation to have. I guess when I was doing the research for the book, I would say the one thing that seems to differentiate the organizations that do and don't, and what I mean by that is those that switch on sustainable, life-giving innovation in all dimensions, is that they zone in on a simple choice. And that is, we are going to do this. Now that sounds far too simplistic and trite at one level. But actually, when you look behind the scenes of what's going on inside organizations, the ones that succeed with innovation are being deliberate about it. So culture has been described as what is ordinary. The way that we do things, the way things happen around here. People like us do this stuff. And yet inside many organizations, you have this expectation that extraordinary things are going to emerge from this ordinary culture. And yet the ordinary culture is set up only to replicate more of what we do today. So as soon as anything new shows up, anything that can't be fit neatly into a process or a budget or a team, it has a very hard time to stay alive. And so when we think about what separates them, how do you go from this A to B journey? It starts with a choice. This will be difficult. Innovation is something that we can manage, just like finance, just like HR, just like sales, anything else. Often it's seen as a black art. And we are going to put ourselves as a leadership team behind that determination to see innovation happen, come what may, whatever it takes. It's going to hurt, but we have no choice. The world's changing faster and, at greater scope than ever before. So to pretend that we can't pursue innovation or that we don't need to is just kidding ourselves. So these people, I think, have a firm grasp of reality. They count the cost and they go for it. And that's what I see lacking inside many organizations, where I think they just hope that innovation will show up. And it really doesn't.
Let's just go back to the term zombie. Okay. So what does zombie evoke in me? It evokes images and associations of people being a bit like a robot, a puppet steered, guided by some malicious force, a bit of a ghost. And actually on your cover, the people that really, really look like zombies, they have that sort of like ghost-like, you can almost see through them, through their limbs. And then obviously there is a personality aspect to that as well. You can be very dull. You can be very sort of like on autopilot. And one of the things that I noticed, I would say specifically in the last 5, 6, 7 years after sort of like the financial crisis, after we mastered that, after we got over that, the economic and the financial crisis, we then had actually a really, really big boom time. The economies have been booming. Lots of companies have been growing. And the bizarre thing, Elvin, is it didn't do anything for the people's energy in the organizations. They seemed to me much more hollowed out than before the financial crisis, even though things look quite great on the outside. How do you explain that?
Well, the thing I see a lot of is really a desire for more for less. And often innovation's lens is one of incremental optimization, efficiency. And it's interesting when I go into an organization for the first time, I'm often met with the plea, really, help us find more innovation. And when you dig a bit deeper, you realize the problem isn't there's not enough innovation. The problem is the scales are skewed. We have far too much incremental innovation going on, which is important. We need to keep the thing moving and, help increase efficiency and effectiveness of everything we do. Absolutely, we need to do that. But it's at the expense of the bigger ideas that actually deliver greater profitability, and they're the ones that are more likely to keep us in the game in the long term. So the real cry, when you dig deeper, is help us find bigger ideas, help us to find bolder ideas. And a real lack of that. And I think it does two things. One is it makes the big idea cupboard empty, but actually, because the focus by default is on incremental innovation, the real desire is for incremental gain, not necessarily at the expense of personal effectiveness, personal energy gain. And I think the two fight against each other. I walk around organizations and just see people looking absolutely exhausted. And when you do some of the work that I do, which is around cultural surveys to help understand to what extent do we have an environment that's conducive to innovation, you dig a little bit deeper and you just see people saying, yeah, I used to love my job. I used to love coming in, the buzz of the team. The team's now in half, but we're all doing the same work. We're all doing 120, 130% of what we used to be doing. No extra resources, no extra grace. Deadlines are getting tighter. So no wonder you see this statistic of 1 in 5 people in America dying simply by going to work, because we're not being realistic about what it means for a human being to do their best work. The flip side of the book had a little bit of a wobble with the title at one point with the publisher and said, I'm not sure about this zombie thing. I don't think people are going to want to self-identify as zombies. We went with it. And I was thinking, actually, this book is Be More Human in many dimensions. Now, I pulled a lot of that stuff out, and that's going to go in another book, I think. But that fundamental unit of analysis as human performance, so that the organization can deliver what it needs to do today, but also design tomorrow, is broken. Again, we come back to this time and time again. It's short-termism. It's get us to the next quarter, this desire for cash, and any wobble that happens in the business model, we immediately clamp down. There's an underlying culture of fear. People can't step out to propose the things they believe the future needs because there's too much at stake. So there are lots of self-reinforcing loops, I think, within businesses that cause us to stay locked into this mode of pursuing short-term gain, incremental innovation, which actually gradually suffocates a business anyway. But it's really at the expense, I think, in many cases, of human well-being. And I'm not at all surprised that in the last 2-3 years, particularly, we're starting to see one of the most popular job titles I see on LinkedIn is, head of well-being. Like, finally, we woke up.
And it seems like that COVID-19, the lockdown, the pandemic, and then perhaps also now the death of George Floyd and what happens in the US with Black Lives Matter, and also in the UK, that one of the previous guests on the podcast, Chris McCulloch, entrepreneur, fantastic human being, he basically said that it's just all unmasking now. It was always there, all the inequalities, all the zombie states, it was always there. And we've done the rat race, we've done the more for less, and we're at the end of the road of this whole productivity, designing our societies, our organizations, and our lifestyles for efficiency. And we literally just gotten to that cliff edge now, where you have these two vectors. You've got the pandemic one, as Bill Gates calls it, i.e. there'll be another one at some point, and it might be a lot more lethal. And then now we have the racial inequality issue, which was always there. We have the rising populism, which has been also interestingly emerging in parallel to this boom time. When I zoom out from all of this, so I see myself, I see you, I see our clients, I see the organizations, I see society at large, I keep coming back to this truism almost, which is there are actually very few bad actors. Most people do not go to work in the morning wanting to be a zombie, wanting to be bad. They just want to be good. So it then boils down to we have many bad incentives. And what bad incentives do you see that get in the way of innovation?
You get what you measure for. Looking at it specifically through the lens of innovation, when you look at organizations who put a single outcome in front of them that they're pursuing that demands a healthy balance of portfolio, it seems to have a very powerful effect on the organization. So let me give you an example. So 3M famously talks about 30% of its revenues need to come from products that didn't exist 4 years ago. Now, that's a really simple yet powerful objective because it's doing several things in unison. The most important, though, is that it's pursuing growth, but it's not pursuing a number. It's not just grow 30% every 4 years, because you can do that through an incremental growth and gradually strangle yourself because you have other trends in the industry coming at you. If you put a demand on a number like that, it forces you to think beyond the status quo. 30% of your revenues coming from things that didn't exist 4 years ago. Now, actually, these days, depending on your industry, that's not a huge rate of churn. So you can play with the numbers, but it forces you to think incrementalism is not going to be enough. If we just increase at 5% a year, which is really what incrementalism will do, that's not going to get us to where we need to be. We have to think bigger. We have to think bolder. We have to, therefore, create an environment in which bolder ideas can show up. And guess what that means? It means we cannot have a culture, or at least areas of the organization where there is a culture of underlying fear, where people feel the stakes are too high to propose something new or to pursue something new. So I think the game changer comes when you have a number that creates an inevitability behind delivering that number and dependencies that require greater humanity in how we pursue things. So I talk in the book, and when I'm talking to organizations, about calibrating culture to outcome. If we only need incremental outcomes, a status quo kind of run the business environment with metrics that are KPIs that deliver certainty, I think that's absolutely fine. And that's a core part of running a business. However, if we do want more high risk, high return ideas to show up, you can't run on the same metrics. There will be greater failure. Therefore, what are we measuring for income revenue too early? If we are, don't expect people to put many ideas forward, because at many early stage ideas are still trying to figure out, are we even solving the right problem? So you have to have an environment where the resourcing, the capabilities, the processes, the metrics are dedicated to working in environments of extreme uncertainty, where you're going to have levels of failure that are around 95%. So how do you create an environment there which is safe to fail, but it's also efficient to fail? This isn't failure for failure's sake. This is the pursuit of learning what could work so that we can drop all the stuff that doesn't work.
It sounds very obvious almost, because the way you described innovation, especially with the metric around the renewal rate of products that you need to launch to the market, to the customers, it reminds me very strongly of how nature actually works, right? So how does adaptation work? Why did the dinosaurs get extinct? And I'm sure that most of the executives that you work with, they know that. They have a very strong innate understanding that innovate yourself now, disrupt yourself now before somebody else does it, when the balance sheet still looks good, when you're profitable. And yet, if you zoom in, I guess, into their brains, into their minds, we are creatures of habit, right? We are hardwired to avoid pain and hardwired to lean into pleasure. So these are the two forces I'm seeing right now listening to you. So on the one hand, you've got the understanding of how nature works, and we're part of nature. And because the organizations are constructs of us, they are an extension of nature, even though there's a lot of tech going in and a lot of artificial stuff. But because they're our extension, they must be part of nature. That's the nature at large, the macro view on nature. And then the micro view on nature, you zoom into your brain and you basically say, can't do it, don't want to do it, maybe tomorrow. And then yet we expect these extraordinary results from innovation. So what are the lead dominoes that you know from your experience that can tip it over, start an organization, and probably starting with a top team or with an executive, to be less zombie and to be more human?
It's being deliberate about how we're going to show up. Innovation is always an argument with the status quo, and it's usually an argument that's unfairly rigged towards the status quo because it's got all of the resources and all of the power. And so you have to create a strategy that holds the tension in a very healthy way in place. And then I think there is also a place for equipping leaders for how to then create that environment in which great ideas have a chance of showing up and developing. Often, I feel for leaders. I mean, who'd want to be a leader right now trying to manage their way through this stuff? What comes next? What choices are you going to make? But we have to. There's no choice. What I find is that usually leaders have risen to their place of influence because they've been really great at doing something well in a status quo context. Not exclusively, but often. They've been a great salesperson. They've been a great IT executive or whatever else. And often that's been delivering today flawlessly. It's been a great performer in that dimension. And they can run great teams that deliver today. What they have less experience in and less training in is how do you run, manage and curate an environment in which more uncertainty can be pursued and explored so that we can find the bigger ideas that we need. And they're very different environments. And I think we often believe that by virtue of their seniority, they must just know how to do this. But the reality is they often don't. And it's quite hard often for an executive, I find, to own up to that. They've been on a beanbag session in California for half a day and, we've ticked the innovation training box. Well, it's kind of not really dealing in reality. So I think there's an aspect that has to follow or come alongside the strategy, which is, come on, there is a level of upskilling and capability that we need here in order to be able to do this well. And that can be difficult for leaders to embrace sometimes. I think that can be quite a blocker. So I think that's the best starting point. From a strategic perspective, you start to put measures and resources in place that allow this thing to show up, not be shut down all the time. I have to be careful as a consultant when I'm going in. Some of this stuff can feel like, it's just too hard. It's just too much work. We'll just keep going. We'll let the next guy figure this out when I've moved on. I found that there's another approach that is bottom up that can actually spark more of an appetite for that conversation. That is around unlocking a culture of experimentation, teaching teams how to lower the stakes of innovation. So everything we're talking about so far is really a matter of fear. Companies scaring themselves to death, literally, because they don't feel safe to take risks. Okay, so how do we increase safety? We lower the stakes for taking the first step at the very least. So what does that look like? Well, all of the work that's been done, Eric Ries 10 years ago, the book, The Lean Startup, that was built on other people's work, but it's about taking an idea, breaking it apart and saying, what are the foundational assumptions that need to be true in order for this idea to work? I can see it in the future working. I can see people buying it and using it, but that's only going to happen if ... So you're understanding your highest risk, most expensive, but least certain assumptions. And we're testing those first. So it's test and learn. It's, pay as you go innovation. You run an experiment, you get the data, and then you move on to the next iteration if the data confirms that. What I've seen inside every organization where I've worked, where they've switched this on, suddenly this democratization of innovation. Teams can run low risk experiments, instead of 50K for a prototype or a pilot, it's £50, $50 testing an assumption. Suddenly the stakes are low. Bosses sit up and go, wow, you tested that crazy idea with £100. Tell me more. And it creates this appetite to release people more into the pursuit of more uncertain ideas because the stakes are so low. So this idea of sense and respond, test and learn, more agile ways of working finally has some runway, finally has a place to get some traction. And then I've noticed it starts to spark an appetite around, well, we're doing experiments. What else could we do? How could we be more strategic about this? And then you can start having more of the other kind of the conversation. But I hate to say it, it's the cheap, fast, dirty experiment way that seems to get most traction most quickly. Do you know what? I don't care. As long as people are out there, they are enjoying their work more because they're reminding themselves of why they got into this business in the first place. Often they're playing with the future. They're looking at customers in another way because the stakes are lower. Those would be the two different approaches that I've seen, bottom up and top down, that seem to gain most traction most quickly.
It does remind me again of how nature actually works, of how adaptation work, of how DNA mutations work. That they're random, they're sudden, they just happen like that. There's no massive master plan behind it. This obviously correlates very strongly with the bottom-up approach, democratizing access to innovation. I quite like that. That seems to be quite at odds with the way innovation mostly works in organization, as you coming back to the executive suite and all the hindrances and the blockages that these people face. With a balanced view of critique and compassion, I do understand, because I work with a lot of executives, that they are almost surrounded by this set of incentives that makes it really, really hard to be an innovation leader, right? Because if you have to hit quarterly results, if you have to follow certain guidelines and restrictions and rules and corporate governance and all the rest of it, a manager, historically, an executive, is a person that not just is responsible for the well-being of people, but also responsible for a lot of assets. And if you talk to corporates, you talk about billions of assets. So they naturally attract people that are more logical, more diligent, more process-driven than probably I am. Whereas I, and maybe you, we are more like the free radicals that want to change things. So I actually have a lot of compassion with what you said, that when you get to a certain level and out of a sudden the task is to innovate yourself out of a mess that you're in, or you've fallen behind the curve, you actually are not really the best innovation practitioner here. And now you should be the innovation leader. So there's almost a built-in breaking point, because this is actually now something that you've never really done. And out of a sudden, everyone is looking at you. And so that's the compassionate side of things. And then the critical side of things is, why is it so hard not just do the beanbag session in Silicon Valley, but then to come back and really practice radical forms of accountability, of like, okay, I understand this cognitively and intellectually, and now I'm going to embody it. Why is this so hard, Elvin?
Coming back to human nature, path of least resistance. Listen, I'm already working a 60-hour week, behind on deadlines. I'm busy. I've got a team that's dysfunctional. I've got, all sorts of other things that are good and less good. Who's got time to do this? Again, it's an outcome of what we measure. I mean, you've probably done this. You sit in on board meetings and you observe the conversations that are going on. You look at how the agenda is structured. Very rarely is there a meaningful conversation in there on an ongoing basis, at least, about the future, about about change that is coming and how we're going to respond to it in a strategic way. Most of the conversations that I observe are tactical, they're operational. Leaders are choosing to be managers. They are far too involved in the day-to-day. I've been in conversations with the boards of global organizations, and there's an office move on the horizon, and they're spending literally half an hour talking about the color of light shades. For me, that is daylight robbery. Robbery of what? Robbery of the future. Every moment that an executive spends meddling with things today that somebody else really should be looking at, you're robbing from the future. Everybody is looking to you for the vision of the future, looking for you for strategy. What is the path that we need to navigate in the future, and what changes are we going to make so that we are relevant in the future? If you're not doing that, nobody else is doing it inside the organization. And actually, that's what you're paid to do. Now, that might sound a little harsh to some people listening to this, but it is the reality. It's a leadership team leading into the future. So if you look at an organization like Amazon, people have different points of view on what Amazon are like as an organization. But I do like the way that Jeff Bezos thinks about the use of his time. I mean, he claims to spend 3 days a week with unstructured time, thinking about the future, mulling strategy, visiting customers, just listening. And I see very little of that, if I'm being really honest, with the leaders that I meet. It's much more around getting caught into the machinations of the day-to-day. I was facilitating a session once. They had the CEO of the organization was in a leadership development program for some emerging talent. Lots of great statements about why we need to be innovating more. This guy sticks his hand up and says, I'd love to be doing this, but I've got no time. I have no time. The day job is just too busy. And quick as a flash, the CEO said, well, how do you think I feel? I run this company and even I don't have time to do innovation. That's messed up. That's completely wrong. The CEO of anybody in the room has control over how they choose to spend their time. And if they feel they can't, then their number one job is to redesign your job, or what you think your job is, so that you can spend time doing the things that the organization needs you to be doing today. What decisions does tomorrow need you to make today so that we can show up in a healthy way? And making different choices around what it means to be a leadership team. And right now, during COVID, when we're recording this, I think it's a great time, although it's hard because everybody's really busy and focused at the moment, to be thinking about what What does leadership look like? What does a leadership team need to look like in order for us to make it through the next 5, 10 years? Are we the right people? Are there gaps in our capability and experience that we need to rapidly supplement, so that we can be the people that tomorrow needs us to be?
For me, it comes back to radical accountability and self-responsibility. So if you really, really want to lead other people, there is only one way. You have got to start with yourself first. It's the same with change, Elvin. If you want to change the organization, you have got to start with yourself. In fact, there is no other way. You can only change yourself. And if you change yourself and transform your habits and your behaviors and what you say and what you think, then maybe that can catalyze, that can invoke a change in somebody around you. I'm having more and more conversations these days that leadership is overrated. Leadership in the context of leading others, leading an organization, leading innovation. That's the application of the core leadership task, and that is to lead yourself. So how does that land on you?
We need to be asking ourselves as leaders, who do we need to become in order to be relevant leaders in that context? Because what we're doing today, 80, 90% of it will probably be very similar, but there will be that 10, 20% where we're having to stretch into areas of life that perhaps we've never done before. We're having to make decisions that we are less confident about. How am I going to develop myself? How am I going to bring people around me who can help challenge and support me so that I can make great decisions in the future? Because that's what I'm paid to do. And I do feel, and I don't think this is an executive issue, I think it's an age issue. We get to a stage in life where we think, yeah, we've got most stuff figured out now. I've kind of done most of the learning that I need to do. I might learn how to do some different gardening, but this is who I am. This is how I show up. I think that's a shame in some respects. I'd like to think I'm continually looking at myself and thinking, how can I be a better version? And that's a bit of a cliche now, but I believe in it. What potential in me has not yet been pulled out, or what new dimensions of myself which could bring value to the world? Personally, I find that quite exciting, but I don't think everybody does. Depends on upbringing, depends on career journey, depends on all sorts of things as to how much courage you have or how much motivation you have to step into things that could potentially be painful. Reasons why I don't do things that could potentially fail. That can go deep. That can go right back to childhood. And to expect to be able to go and solve that on a half-day workshop somewhere is crazy. People are just going to push back and shut down. So there's an interesting bigger point here for me, which I haven't really fully thought through, but it'd be interesting to explore a little bit maybe, which is, I can't help but think when you look at the way that organizations are being run, and we look at some of the mental health issues that are showing up because of that, not exclusively because of the workplace, there's tons of other stuff going on in society as well. If we want to employ high-performing people, to what extent is it our responsibility to really pursue mental health and actually provide almost hospital level psychological support so that people can get over stuff from their past if they want to? Because if actually fear of failure is a big issue that I can't ever deal with in a corporate training environment, then there's always going to be a ceiling on some people's ability to step into risk. Now, if we want people to show up and do their best work, at what point do we say yes and no to giving them a level of support that they might not get elsewhere? They might not feel able to pursue elsewhere, either because it's not accessible or they can't afford it. How vested are we really in the well-being of people, not just so that they show up and are healthy, but actually they're able to step into the kinds of work that we're saying that we need them to do? I don't know. It's a tough one, and there's some ethical issues in there as well.
It's fascinating. It probably hits a lot of my buttons in terms of what I'm concerned about, what I'm interested and passionate about. So let me start here. And that is the 3 C's of performance, of learning, whatever you want to call it. So you first have competence. And competence literally means you are able to do something in a very mechanical way. So take tennis. I used to play tennis quite badly, but that's a metaphor that I'm quite familiar with. When you learn tennis, there is actually a ball machine, not just a coach. And the ball machine really, really hones your backhand and your forehand because you do it hundreds and thousands of times. And you can actually be remarkably decent with the ball machine. And that's just competence. Okay. And then obviously you want to have a match with somebody. So you are actually having a real human being on the other side of the net. And this is where capability comes in. So capability now is your ability to actually apply this technical skill or competence that you just learned. So She serves and you return. And that means you need to return with your forehand or your backhand. And they might slice the return, so you actually have to adapt a little bit. So that's what capability is. And that's why it's already more complex for your brain and for your body to do this well, because the ball machine just hits the ball almost with precision exactly to the same spot on the court. The player in front of you doesn't. So that's the difference between competence and capability. And the third thing is what we call capacity. That's your inner capacity to rise to the occasion. And to stay with tennis, so I never really played many tournaments, maybe 2, 3 in my life. But when you are actually a champion, when you are on the center court and it's match ball against you and the first serve goes in the net, and now what? You know, we all know, the ones who know tennis, it's like there is this routine, this drill of going back to the line, you know, dribbling the ball and then having that exact movement of now making that second serve. Now, you have done that when you become Boris Becker or Djokovic, any of these famous tennis players. You have done this probably millions of times, but that means nothing. That's the competence level. And you have played against this player probably hundreds of times. That's the capability. Now it is all down to what is in yourself. Can you overcome your fears? You know, how mentally tough are you right now to just blank out all the craziness? And so zooming away from this example from tennis and plonking it or applying it to organizations and organizational performance and learning and so forth. Where do you think we spend most of our energy and our time and our budgets and our resources? We develop people's competencies, their competence frameworks in almost every organization. And they obsessively and incessantly drill people into some competencies that are probably irrelevant in 3 to 5 years' time, because that comes along. That's almost like a necessary, obvious parallel process to your 30% KPI at 3M, that if, you know, in 3 years' time, 30% of your products need to be new, that also means that a lot of the upskilling will be in completely different territories. And so we have a complete overinvest on competence and capabilities in organization and a dramatic underinvest in capacity. And now segue that to what you said about mental health, because mental health, that is part of your inner capacity. This is why, for instance, Boris Becker coached and mentored Djokovic when he seemed to be the eternal number 2. He could never break through, because Boris noticed it's just all his inner game. It's what is in him, the fear, you know, the I can't do this, the kind of like the stories we tell ourselves. And so how can we bring more of that safe space to talk about yourself, to talk about the practitioner into the organizations, and balance this more with the practice, whether that's innovation, change, or product development, whatever it is? Because that's coming back to your incentives. That's where I see almost like a 95-5% split in terms of where the budgets go. The budgets go into the practice. And then you've got these like leading self-leadership seminars. They're often called the divorce seminars because some people tend to then divorce from their partners afterwards. And they are almost looked down. They're almost like condescending connotation that comes with it. And again, that's fear, right? That's especially from men in power. That's probably their inability to show vulnerability. So what do you make of that?
You know, one of the things that I often just put out there as a challenge is, to what extent is there a connection between personal vulnerability and corporate vulnerability in this company? Your people's feeling that they can challenge the status quo, propose a new way of doing something, that's connected to our ability to show up in the future. So if we can't put ideas on the table and pursue ideas that are going to be the things that create relevance for us in the future, there is this connection between vulnerability at a personal level and at a corporate level. So I absolutely see it. I don't think there's any easy answer to this. I think it depends on individuals. I think it depends on the culture of a leadership team, the culture of an organization, where people are in their life, what they've got appetite for. So I don't think there are easy answers. I think we can put metrics in place that put a demand on organizational health that at least put these sorts of things on the table to explore. And hopefully you've got a group of people around you who are willing to go on a level of exploration to pursue some of this stuff. But the last piece of work that I did, looking at an organization's entrepreneurial culture and to what extent it was match fit, you know, ready to go to the next level of growth, which is quite ambitious in this case. And some issues came up during the interviews with the execs, and I played it back to the sponsor of this piece of work. and suggested that there might be a couple of individuals for whom coaching in some dimensions would be useful. There was silence at the other end of the phone. And she said, well, what you need to understand is that in this culture, coaching is seen as remedial. It means there's something wrong with you. And you can't be seen to have a coach beyond a certain level because it means you're not up to it. And you think, oh my goodness. I mean, some of that is linguistics, but a lot of it isn't. It's this crazy culture, this crazy way that we've set up where I have to be right. You know, there's that great book, Teaching Smart People to Learn. And our ability to let go of control, the need to be right, and all sorts of things is mixed up in this altogether. So I'm not going to pretend I've got the magic silver bullet for this, but I think the more you can create a strategic frame for the need for greater vulnerability inside an organization so that we're less vulnerable commercially in the future, the more you've got a chance that you can pull people into conversations that help them make choices to deal with some of the issues that do create a sense of cement in their desire to be vulnerable.
Can we expect that to happen from the current power structures? You've got a CEO, you've got an executive team, a lot of them are male. Can we expect that from this part of the system, or should we not rather invest in and educate and equip and empower the rebels, the revolutionaries bottom up?
It's interesting. When I was writing the book, I went to meet with another innovation consultant. He was also writing a book. It's more around how do you create a culture of experimentation, looking very much at that as a focus, really a learning organization, but through the lens of experimentation. He said, what's your book on? So I told him. He said, you shouldn't bother writing that book. It's pointless. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, most big companies are so broken. There's no point in trying to fix them. They're just hardwired for entropy. Death is an inevitability. It's just a matter of time. I think it depends. Every organization is different, and I've got higher levels of hope in some than others. And one of the things that motivates me is even if I can go into an organization and help a 10% shift so that it's got a better chance of showing up and the people who work there get a better quality of working life, that's worth doing. And of course, I'd like to see more, but I kind of know where he's coming from. And I think this is why innovation finds it so hard to show up, is that when you look at that picture, here's where we are today, a group of executives. Here's what it's going to take to become that organization that is a high level of innovation performance. The journey isn't easy. Sure, there are frameworks and things that you can pursue, and it does work, but it requires deliberate, sustained effort. Now, are you going to choose that pursuit over the next 2 or 3 years as a team to really look in on that and create an amazing innovation process ecosystem? Or would you rather pursue the path of least resistance and we'll try a little bit of that? But actually, we all know there's this sort of complicit agreement amongst us that we're just going to keep our heads down and keep going because there's too much at stake to lose if that picture goes wrong. Now, it doesn't have to be that on and off, that binary. But I think that's often the perception, is that the stakes are too high for us to pursue that. So there are some interesting conversations here, I think, at the corporate level to have around how do we change what's happening at the top. I think a lot of it can come down to metrics. But I also think, the move more towards decentralization and the way that organizations like ING and Spotify work, it's squads, it's more autonomous work, it's decision making being pushed to the edges of the organization, outcome driven, all of that movement. I think it's bound to net out somewhere in the middle in many organizations where there is a greater degree of autonomy, executives realizing there's no way that we can make all of the decisions that tomorrow needs. We're going to have to allow some parts of the organization to go and explore the future in ways that we haven't before, and in ways actually that many other companies already have. It's not like we don't have any precedents here. You look at the tops of most industries, you'll find some great innovators. It's not rocket science in some respects. It's a choice to move some different needles in some different areas. So again, I think it's hard because it does come down to personal motivation at many levels, at a leadership level. But I do have hope, even in environments that are highly conservative. I've seen, this experimentation approach, people who genuinely want to pursue a better future for the organization, better ways of working internally, doing this lean experimentation approach where the risks, the stakes are low. It allows the boss to feel safer and sponsor more of that kind of work so that we are actually getting some of what we know we need the future needs. Now, that's not a perfect world, but I think you're right. It's definitely bottom up as well as top down.
In your book, you come up with some really compelling examples of how this lowering the risk, lowering the threshold, the budget requirements for these experimentations. And could you just talk about one or two, and then also tell the listeners, what does it actually take to get to that stage to say, let's just run a small little risk? And so almost like a little case study, like, because it sounds great. You mentioned this earlier, like, instead of 5,000 or 50,000 pounds, somebody did something for 50. But how do you even get to that moment where somebody does 50? One way is to get inspired by people who've done it before. So what are your favorite examples from the book in that respect?
I think my all-time favorite is actually quite an old story, and it's IBM were looking at voice recognition technology back in the 70s. And if you imagine how hugely expensive that pursuit would have been back then when computers were really still, the context they were looking at was, how could we bring voice automation into the office? How could we remove the need for typing? And all you would do is talk at your computer and it would suddenly, the words would suddenly appear. And they were looking to disrupt the desktop market. What they could have done is gone off and spent hundreds of millions of dollars inventing this stuff, piloting it in, market trials, all sorts of things. But what they did instead was, what I say in the book, dream big, start small. What's the smallest possible experiment we could run to test the assumption that anybody even wants this stuff, that actually it would do what people want, that it would create the value that we believe it could create, and people would then start to show up and buy this stuff. So what they did is they set up this room, and it had a computer monitor, a desk and a chair. And they invited people to come in and sit down. And they said, listen, just talk to the screen and see what happens. So they would just say random words, and these random words would suddenly appear on the screen. And they're like, oh my goodness, looking under the table, what's going on here? Is it magic? What was happening? And so they'd encourage them to have a conversation and talk. And sure enough, every word is appearing on the screen perfectly. So what they didn't know is that in another room, there was a typist with a headset on who could hear what was being said because of a hidden microphone and was just typing on the screen what was being said. But it created the impression that this thing actually existed. And that's the heart of a great experiment. It's creating an authentic experience of the thing that you're imagining, but at next to no cost, so that you can get the highly accurate feedback that you need, because market testing is notoriously bad and inaccurate. You ask people whether they want something and they say yes, and then when you bring it to them fully made, they say, well, no, it was supposed to be yellow and sort of more oblong than that. That what we imagined is not kind of what showed up. Research out last week was saying, again, the number one reason that startups failed last year was we were trying to sell a product that no one wanted, or at least they didn't want enough to pay to change their behavior, which is ultimately what innovation is. It's behavior change. So I really like that idea because it is a huge potential idea, but they brought it down to a tiny experiment. And guess what? They chose not to go ahead with it in the end. They learned that it was a bad idea. Why? What could possibly be wrong? Well, when they scaled that out into an office environment, the level of noise in the office was so high that it actually became quite difficult to speak, to hear yourself think. And then the communications were getting jammed and people couldn't type properly. Speaking for a couple of hours suddenly starts to give you a bit of a sore throat. You got confidentiality issues. So by running that small test and scaling it ever so slightly, they were able to find out some stuff, big assumptions that they could test before they even built the product. So that's the heart of the experiment, is what can we learn about whether we should even build this before we build it? It's a kind of a counterintuitive question, but it's quite alluring and pulls people in. And so let me give you an example of this in practice. So I was doing some work for a few years inside one of the big record labels. And what we did was we had 70 people for a week. We put them through this boot camp experience of teaching them the principles of how to design experiments and lots of other things. And at the end of that week, each team was challenged to go out and run an experiment just to put it into practice, but actually something that could bring some business benefit back to the organization. So there was one team that had this really interesting question that we helped them frame to solve, which was, how could we predict hits without listening to any music? And you think, what on earth are you talking about? How on earth can you solve that? So the backstory on this is we teach these people in these programs to design what we call catalytic questions that are so big and pull us out of today's frame that they could result in a game-changing technology. And this was ultimately the focus of this particular program. So they wanted to figure out, is there a way that we could somehow automate finding hits? So, and they had no idea how they were going to solve it, but they came up with this really neat idea. And it was, well, what about if we just take a very small sample of people and we run some brain scanning activity while they're listening to different types of music, create a benchmark for what your brain signals look like when you're listening to music that was a hit and music that wasn't a hit. And they randomized it and did all sorts of things. So they found this place in Belgium. They found 12 people. They designed these experiments with these university researchers, and they ran the numbers. Oh my goodness. They found this really interesting correlation between brainwave patterns and hit music, whether you'd heard it or not, and they had to normalize around music they'd already heard. So they came back to the sharing of this data, and they'd spent hardly anything because they were working with a university lab. I think it was a couple of €1,000 or something they managed to scrape together. But they were able to come back and say, okay, this isn't the finished solution, but based on just 12 brain scans with this number of this data sample, we are already starting to see a correlation here under these circumstances when an algorithm can look at music and determine whether it will create the same brainwaves. So ultimately what they were saying was, can we just run, people send in their demo work, we run it through a computer and it says, yes, this is going to be a hit because it's going to generate these kind of brainwaves, or no, it's not, or it's somewhere in the middle. So the idea was it would help them determine whether to invest in certain artists. And they were able to come back and say, at very low cost, we've found something that is worthy of pursuit. They hadn't solved the whole thing, and it may be that later down the line that they would have discovered actually it's only under these circumstances. But you could have looked at that problem and said, okay, we need to invest a ton of money behind trying to solve that problem, and only to find out that it was wrong. So actually that caused a huge controversy inside that organization around art. Is music art or is it commercial? And, should we even allow this sort of stuff over the threshold of our door? But it's an example of dream big, start small, create data, which you can then take to as a manager and say, okay, this is trending in this direction. We believe now it's time to invest to the next level. It's pay-as-you-go innovation. And inside one organization that I was working with recently, I was delighted to hear the CEO say, we've made the flip now. The flip is this. I say to people, don't bring me ideas, bring me experiments. Ideas are 10 a penny. None of us really know whether they're going to work or not, particularly if they tiptoe outside the boundaries of what we're very familiar with today, cause and effect. Bring me an experiment which has objective data that helps me make a great decision about whether this is something that we can dedicate some of our finite resources to, that gives a greater chance of being relevant in the future. So that model of train people quickly, cheaply, effectively to run experiments and then allow them to go and do more exploratory work, give them 10% of their time, 5% of their time to go off and do this kind of stuff. It starts to create this flywheel effect of bigger ideas showing up inside the organization. Now, there's the management of those ideas, which is another conversation, but certainly trying to flush them out by lowering the stakes, because innovation is starting with an experiment and a question is a good way to go about it.
These two examples, they have at the heart what I think is the issue here and perhaps also the solution. So when I talk about the practice and the practitioner are inextricably linked, I mean that you want to be an innovation practitioner, great. You got to feel innovation inside. And what does it connotate? Feeling. You need to have an emotion. And before you can have an emotion, you need to have a brainwave. So when you just talked about the second example, I all of a sudden had a few dots that I could join up that perhaps I have never seen like that before. So here you go. Going back to the IBM example, I think the reason why this was genius is because they acted as if. They didn't need to do anything. This was probably, in the innovation history, one of the first best mock-ups ever made for hardly any money. Because it did what? It gave people a visceral experience of what this innovation product could actually look, sound, and feel like. And this is the key thing. And now getting into a completely other field that I'm fascinated by and practice every day, And that is the law of attraction field, which a lot of people think is esoteric. And I certainly thought this is the biggest woo-woo bourgeois on the planet until I actually practiced it and until I experienced it, what it does to you. And this also links back to, I think, with what you said earlier about leaders and corporate executives. You have to start imagine what leader you want to become. If you can't imagine that you're going to be an innovation leader, you will never be. It doesn't matter on how many beanbag sessions in Silicon Valley you do or go. If you can't imagine yourself in an updated version, being more vulnerable, allowing more failure, saying to people it's okay to take risks and even look stupid, if you can't imagine that, I would now say, as a hypothesis, you will never ever be a great innovation leader because of the brainwave, which gets triggered by an external stimulus or by a thought. And then that brainwave triggers an emotion. And if that emotion makes you feel good about it, or to your last example, it could even be, as you said, like it triggered all sorts of conversations in that company about, should we even allow this? Well, this is fear. This is emotion, right? And this is perhaps what it really, really boils down to in order to get away from being zombie towards being more human, more unicorny, more angel-y, is to actually allow that in ourselves. And you said earlier something in the context of what a corporate executive needs to actually do is they need to give some life-giving practices. So innovation is all about life, isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, the word we used earlier is renewal. It's finding new expressions for creating value, and it's life. And one of the things that I think is a very helpful and healthy framer for anybody is, to what extent am I a source of life in this situation? What am I empowering? What am I enabling? And particularly in the context of innovation. So I talk in the book about everybody is a user experience. People experience you and it creates emotions in them, which then trigger thought patterns and behaviors. You need to really be very aware of your user experience so that you're creating one where people do feel safe and confident to do the thing that we're asking them to do. I think there's a lot in what you say that is helpful for executives to be thinking about in sponsoring it and creating environments where innovation can show up.
And I'd like to bring this quite complex and content-rich and multidimensional conversation to the level of self and stitch a few things together that we said in the last hour or so. And starting with what you said and what I strongly echo is there are not many bad actors, they're just bad incentives. And the incentive you then said often is to just produce incremental innovation. 10, 15 minutes ago or so, you said, well, sometimes it's actually really, really hard and you want to go in, or you go into your client or new clients with like these big, hairy ideas. And then they basically say, let's just do 10% more. And I find myself in that situation time and time again that, my company is called Audacify, right? So I want to get people to be just more audacious, just be bold, be fearless. Whatever it is you're doing, don't bullshit. Just do what you say you were going to do to yourself and to your employees and to your stakeholders. And so I'm all about that. And at the same time, I need to make a living. So on a scale from 1 to 10, if I look back over the last 5 years, there have certainly been clients where it wasn't an 8 or a 9 in the sense of purity of what I'm doing. It was perhaps a 2 or 3 or 4. And that's okay because you make these people 10, 15, 20% more innovative or more receptive to change, whatever it is, right? The practice. So we as practitioners, aren't we complicit in the system? Aren't we the ones that can change ourselves and say, I'm now deciding as a KPI, coming back to the 3M example, in the next 4 years or in the next year, 3 out of 10, so 30% of my client engagements, they need to actually be above the 6 or above the 8 even, right? Because otherwise, I'm just going to be complicit in doing the 10% more innovation, the 10% more change. And it all boils down to probably one of the very few things that I for sure know is true, and that is change can only start with you in the here and now. So how does that land on you as an innovation practitioner?
What I want to do is to show up and be as helpful as I can in the context that I find myself. And I'll calibrate that according to what's needed. There's not a lot of sense in me turning up in a situation and being really provocative in trying to encourage a very conservative organization or one that is very fearful for different reasons to try and do things that I think are probably beyond its reach right now. So I think I would always go in and calibrate what I'm proposing around the context and a journey that there is appetite for. Otherwise, I think you can just create a lot of frustration. That would be my starting point. But to your point around how can I help more organizations kind of move the needle from a 6 to an 8. I am having to think about how I do that. And, writing a book was something that I felt was the right thing to do at a time. But I always knew at the back of my mind that not many people read business books. And when they do read business books, they never finish them because they're dipping in and dipping out looking for ideas, which is why I wrote the book in very short chapters so that you could do that. And thankfully, the feedback's come back and seems to have validated that that was the right choice to make. But I'm trying to look at, and I don't have any hard and fast answers yet on this, to look at my own industry, which is really around consulting, and thinking, play this forward 10 years when you've got AI, automation, all sorts of things, AR, VR, all coming together. How much of what I do today will be able to be done in very different ways with different technology, and I will be redundant effectively. The knowledge that I have can be somehow imparted. The challenge that I can bring can show up contextually in the right way, in the right place. I have no doubts that a large chunk can be overtaken. So I'm currently in the situation where I'm thinking, how do I help what I know show up in different formats that can embed in workflow in different ways, that can bring challenge, observations, examples, whatever it needs to be, that are nothing to do with me being in a room or on the other end of a phone. It could be embedded into your phone or into your watch or whatever it is. It's context specific. I have no idea what that looks like. And if I'm really honest, I don't know if I have the appetite to go down that route anyway. In front of my desk, I had this postcard which says, solve hard problems. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm drawn to. That's a hard problem to solve. It's basically the reinvention of the consulting industry, which I know others are looking at. But I've got a few ideas that I'm currently spinning that are going to be long-term pieces of work, some of which are digital, some of which are deeply human and face-to-face. So as you say, being a practitioner, I've got to eat my own dog food and have this portfolio in front of me. What bets am I placing, which are incremental improvement that keeps me alive for another year commercially, but also what are the things the other side of this current disruption can I start to put in place now that are going to give me a greater chance of showing up as an effective value-adding innovation consultant in the future?
What are you doing right now, and how do you foresee yourself in changing your practice, I guess, away from workshops, training, seminars, keynotes, towards something that specifically can invoke more accountability in these executives? Because what I've been doing in the last 10, 15 years was good. And whenever it's not good, whenever it doesn't lead to a lot of impact, it's because whatever I was doing, whatever method I was using, it didn't create that sense of accountability in my sparring partner, in the executives. And what I'm experiencing now very, very strongly is, because I have much more frequent, shorter conversations with people, it's just so much easier to hold them accountable. And it almost sounds quite unfancy, but I'm just very often writing back an email and that really provokes something. Or this peer of mine, she basically gets paid for having email ping pong. People have questions and then she writes answers. And because so many have questions and so many answers she provides, eventually she said, well, that's actually my job now. That's my proposition. It's not standing in front of people doing rah-rah type workshops. It's actually helping people very contextually, very time bound as well, because that problem might only be a problem for 24 hours. How does it sound to you, and what are you doing on your end to innovate the innovator's practice?
I guess I can only look at it through my particular lens. And I guess this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I was finding that I was going into contexts, whether it was a consulting assignment around helping a leadership team figure out what does an innovation framework look like for us and how do we start to switch this on and developing leaders. Either that or in a leadership development program that's got a specific focus on innovation, and that can be emerging potential, all kinds of different programs. The common issue that I found was that the biggest question was, don't tell us why, don't tell us what, just tell us how to innovate. It's the how, it's the pathway that was missing. And when I would walk away from assignments, I felt frustrated that I couldn't leave them something that was something that was like an end-to-end view of, innovation strategy, process, culture, leadership, resourcing, that has practical frameworks and tools in, so that when I'm not in the room, there's at least something that can be referred back to. And there's tons of great innovation books out there, but I'm just finding that I couldn't recommend any of them because they haven't got the section on culture. And that's the big issue for you guys. So some of it was born out of frustration in wanting to do that and answer that question, how? And what I've found is that when you can put in front of a leadership team who doesn't have a lot of experience in innovation from the past, for whatever reason, something that demystifies innovation and shows that a process can show up and you can measure this stuff and you can track it and you can create portfolios lending themselves to their ways of thinking and working that they're familiar with. Once you decode it, once you start to demystify it, it suddenly creates a light bulb moment and then a confidence to go, oh, okay, I think we can work with this. And they won't articulate that directly. But in the absence of that, innovation often still feels like culture. I think it's a black art. It's not something you can pin down. Absolutely, you can. I guess my contribution right now to encouraging leaders to feel more confident around innovation is providing a version of the how that at least can get them to first base. So being really honest, I mean, the next 2 years is me trying to take some of these ideas that are in the book and other resources that I'm producing, bite-sized, but also still things that are 2 or 3 days long because people are still asking me for those things in different formats. How can I help you make progress in this context? And a lot of it is giving an example of what how looks like, feels like, what it's required to lead it. And then how do we embed that into day-to-day working? How can we identify the enemies of the future, the friction in the system that could fight against this? And having very practical conversations about, okay, so what do we need more or less of? What do we need to stop, start? It's not always rocket science, but it's having those very focused conversations, knowing that unless we deal with certain issues that have a fundamental cause and effect on innovation's ability to show up, we're not going to move the needle. So it's the book, and certainly in the short term, and different expressions of the book in digital face-to-face formats that are going to allow people to have those conversations and build their confidence.
Zooming out from all of this, because we very much talked about innovation in organizations at the level of self, in teams, in the executive suite, where would you actually want the combined innovation power to be applied at? What do you think is in most dire need of innovation?
So often an organization will be product centric. It's looking at what made us great, what got us to here, and we're continually refining that. We're doing version 7.64 and we're iterating our way forward. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's all good. Although ultimately it tends to run out of steam. We have industry transitions that kind of show up like a Star Wars spaceship from hyperspace that we didn't see. And actually we could have seen it coming sooner if we'd wanted to, but there's another issue. What we're looking at there is a very product driven, internally focused, often, majoritarily the case, political, often driven focus on how we show up in the marketplace, or at least what we deliver to the marketplace. And there is a vulnerability there because we're not really looking at the underlying progress that an organization ought to be trying to deliver for a customer. So in any context, a customer is trying to make particular progress. We buy products to help us make progress, not because we want more products. So trying to decode, and in the book we talk about how do you decode, what are the fundamental, most important areas of progress. So I think certainly from a point of view that stops an organization being so wedded to technology that will ultimately become irrelevant, and therefore stops us being so focused on incremental innovation, and therefore the short-termism and all of the stuff that we talked about earlier around the human condition that can create and well-being. I think it's a much healthier flip to look at what isn't actually going to change too much. What progress do customers want? And we'll be more agnostic about the kind of technology that is required for this to show up in the future. So at the moment, I think Netflix is a good example of this. Their stated aim is to help people find great movies, not to run the best film streaming service in the world. We all know they started in DVDs and they made the flip to streaming. They don't actually care too much about the technology that's required. They care more about the progress. And it's enabling progress that I think allows a healthier organizational environment. It means we're much more likely to show up in the future because we're tracking with relevance and how we stay relevant. I guess what that then comes down to is we're still operating in a largely capitalist environment, and people can make choices about what they believe is useful progress for human beings to make. And so we're still going to come down to organizations who some may believe are making things that are superfluous for the environment, use of resources, all those sorts of things. That's harder to police. But certainly at the organizational level, I think to ensure longevity of organizations, to reduce the friction, the churn, the pain that goes on because of needless, often cyclical disruption and endless transformation programs, because we're not doing a good enough job at tracking weak signals coming from the future, being able to sense and respond. Instead, we have these big rug pulling exercises every 2 or 3 years because we didn't anticipate what was coming fast enough. So there's something in this for me, which is around our ability to focus on progress rather than product, suddenly creates in us a capacity for, I think, better work for the customer, better environment for employees to do their work, and actually a better commercial environment in the future.
Yeah, I would naturally assume that companies that are more purpose-driven, more progress-centric, correlates with a higher employee well-being and more with what you want, what you desire, what you put out in your book, people to be more human, more angel-like. That, for me, an angel connotates it's soulful, it's warm-blooded, it's wise, it's what the world needs, right? Not necessarily what our egos with the distractions want, right? There's a big difference between what people need and what people want. And if you zoom out from the individual level, it's what a society needs and versus what a society wants. And that perhaps correlates also with the status quo, at least pre-COVID, that the companies that feel more zombie and the people in there feel more zombie, that perhaps it correlates with constantly churning out products in that 10%, slightly better, slightly more expensive, that probably no one's really asked for. I'd like to finish on that note that progress centricity is probably more important than product centricity and will do a lot of that life-giving to organizations and to individuals that you postulated earlier. Elvin, where can people get your book and where can people reach you?
Well, the best starting point, I guess, is my website, www.elvinturner.com. That will give you links to different places where you can buy the book. There's a lot of free resources, actually, that I've produced to go sit alongside the book as well. And you'll find signposts there as well. So that's probably the best place. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, equally, that would be great. I'm just interested in connecting with anyone who's interested in similar sorts of conversations, trying to move things forward, because I'm here to learn as well. And I'm very aware every client project that I work in, I learn new stuff. So I'm trying to grow my own expertise in this area by working with more variety of different people. So don't hesitate. I know sometimes there is this sense that you shouldn't, you can't talk to the author because he's too busy. Please don't think that. I'm interested in as much feedback as possible. So I'd welcome that.
Awesome. Well, Elvin, thank you so much for this really, really enlightening conversation. We covered a lot of ground and I'll catch you soon.
Great. Thanks, Marcus, for having me on.
Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. You can find some useful links in the podcast notes. I have lined up some amazing guests for the next few episodes, and I would love your feedback, thoughts, and suggestions so that I can evolve this experiment based on what's needed in the business world right now. I want to make capitalism much more conscious, and for that, we need businesses to have more purpose, more people to show more leadership, and organizations to have more positive impact on stakeholders, including our blue planet, the only known habitable place in the universe. You can email me on hello@marcusdroon.com or search for Marcus Droon on LinkedIn. Please do subscribe to my podcast and share this with others. Catch you soon. Not back to normal.